All right, it is October the 22nd. Yesterday and today we were talking about environmental science careers. Yesterday we went through the notes. It was a fair amount of notes, but it's going to make today easier. So if you didn't do those outlines yesterday, you want to make sure that you do it today. It's pretty simple. Most of this stuff is pretty straightforward. Water resources is management of water resources. All right, everybody knows you have to have water in order to live. Right? You have to have water, you have to have air, you have to have food. But water will kill you faster than not having food. So water is a really important thing. Soil resources, we're focused on that top layer of the surface. We haven't really talked about that yet, but we're going to. That's called the egg horizon. That's where you're going to get all of your runoff, your pollution. It's where your root growth is. So soil resources is a really important thing to manage. The easiest way to remember the forestry is that trees grow in the forest. Look, trees grow in the forest. As long as you remember that, you will never get any questions wrong about that. Wildlife, any animal that can live without help of people is wildlife. We talked about a couple of different animals, domesticated versus wildlife. The one animal that's kind of in between is pigs. All right, if you're talking about a pig, North Carolina is number one in the production of hogs. So if you're raising pigs and you're doing it for a production standpoint, that's a domesticated animal. But we also have wild pigs, right? Wild boar. Those are wildlife. They don't need help to live. So you do have some animals that can fit both classifications. Essentially what we did is we just went through some different careers. I'm a soil scientist. They're going to classify soils. If you are a scientist or an engineer or a biologist, you have to have at least a 4 years degree, which is a bachelor's degree. We've talked about a bachelor's degree before. If you see any questions about a 4-year degree, it's going to be a scientist or a biologist. Okay, so a scientist classifies soil, and then a soil conservation is actually going to go out and they're going to help the landowners apply different practices to help preserve their soil, whether or not it's a buffer area around a pond or a way to come up with some sort of plant or practice to keep soil from washing off a hill. That's what a soil conservationist does. The easiest way to remember a soil technician is a technician takes samples. Technician takes samples. So they're going to take the samples, they're going to give them to the soil scientist, and then the soil scientist is going to classify your land. An ecologist, they're concerned about the impact of the environment on the animal life. We discussed the wildfires in California. When you have massive acreage burning like that, it places a really big stress on wildlife. An ecologist will assess the situation and then kind of determine whether or not wildlife are going to be coming back to that area, if they're going to be overstressed, were there any kind of endangered species that now need to be searched for, so forth and so on. A wildlife biologist does have to have a master's degree. The biggest thing about a biologist is that they advise governments, all right? So wildlife biologists in North Carolina, most of them are employed by the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission. So what they're doing is they're doing different studies. For example, if you were a deer hunter, and let's say we can harvest 6 deer this year. So that's all made possible through wildlife biologists in their studies. So if they determine that this year too many deer were harvested, or if blue tongue or some other disease affects the wildlife, and now next year our deer population is half of what it is now, they would advise the government to change the harvest from 6 to possibly 2, right? So a biologist is really important when it comes to establishing game laws. So a biologist is going to advise governments. A wildlife officer is the same thing as a game warden. So they're going to go out and enforce hunting and fishing laws. They're employed by the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission again. Enforces hunting and fishing laws. Now, in North Carolina, you do not have to have a bachelor's degree in order to be a wildlife officer. However, it's really hard to get a job as a wildlife officer. Typically, you may have 3 spots come open, and you may have 300 or 400 people apply for them. So if you don't have a bachelor's degree, you're not going to be as qualified as some of those other candidates that are applying for that position. So it's recommended, it's not required, but you're going to have a hard time getting a job as a game warden if you don't have some type of bachelor's degree. So, and then we just talked about different things. Wildlife officers have no experience in wrestling alligators, all right? But if there's a wildlife issue, it's the wildlife officer that's going to be responsible for helping remove that animal from whatever presence or property it's on. They spend a lot of time out on the water and enforcing boating laws and doing safety checks. The biggest thing that wildlife officers are checking for is making sure you have the proper registration and you have all the safety equipment in your boat, whether or not it's life preservers, first aid kit, fire extinguishers. So they're basically making sure that you are safe while you are out boating on the waters. They also do investigations as well. This was from several years ago. Somebody shot a bald eagle with a rifle. Bald eagles are protected species. You're not allowed to hunt or harvest them. And so they were actually offering a $10,000 reward for the information leading to the arrest of this person. Kind of flipping through, a wildlife manager is going to help manage game populations on public land. So right up the road, we have the game land in Caswell County. So a wildlife manager is the person that's going to help, right? And they're going to be out there managing the food plots, forest, the shooting range that's out there. That's what a wildlife manager does. And then a wildlife technician is going to work with wildlife biologists. They're going to go out there and actually tag animals so that way you can do the different researches on there. A silviculturalist scientifically classifies forest. A forester does just that. If you had, I don't know, 2 or 3 acres of woods on your property and you were trying to find some way to where you wanted to harvest those trees and plant new trees, but you weren't sure how to do it, you could call up the extension agency, and they have forestry employees there from the forestry department. They will come out and they would help you and come up with a plan as far as what you could do for your property. An urban forester is just that. If you're driving down 70 through downtown, we have all these trees growing through Burlington along the highways. So technically that would be an urban forester that would be responsible for taking care of those. A timber cruiser, typically they work for a forestry company. So what happens is if you are harvesting timber on your property, right, they pay you in order to harvest those trees. Well, it's the timber cruiser who comes out and evaluates the timber, like how much is your timber worth? So what they're doing is they're calculating the timber volume, and then based off the volume is how they do the pricing. You do not have to have a degree to do this. It's a high school diploma with some specialized training. So forestry company, timber cruiser, and then you have a logging foreman. So a logging foreman is in the harvesting phase because you are actually cutting down the trees and removing them. A foreman is going to be that person who oversees that entire operation. The loggers are going to be the one cutting down the trees. Once those trees are cut down, you have to move the trees from where they're cut to where you load them on the trucks. And that's done with this thing called a skidder. So a skidder operator is going to move trees from the cutting site to the loading area. That's what a skidder looks like. This is a feller buncher. This is used on really large tracts of land. What it allows you to do is cut each individual tree and place them in a pile. It helps protect the soil erosion runoff. So it makes it easier because the skidder only has to drive one way. They don't have to drive across the entire property. It's called a feller buncher. And soil and water management specialists are in demand around the entire world. Water is a renewable natural resources. If you don't manage it correctly, you can have streams go away, rivers go away, and then that impacts where do you get your water from, right? So it's on demand from the global scene. For today's class, what we have is a matching review. It is underneath 5.01. It's on the very bottom of your module. You need to do that review and submit it. It's in a matching quiz form, and that will more than likely be your last grade for this 9 weeks. So please get that done today, and I will see you all in class tomorrow.